Thanks, everybody. It's good to be here. Let me apologize first for my head cold. I've been ill the last couple of weeks, and not with COVID though. And I'm still really stuffy and my throat is kind of rough. So forgive me if I lose my voice or if I need to stop and take a drink. But I am really excited to be here with you today. This was a talk I was supposed to give back in July, but I got sick then too. So hopefully there's not a relationship between this particular talk and my health, but even so, I'm excited to give it today. It brings together a lot of my research and teaching over the past several years. And as I was reviewing it today, I thought, well, maybe it's time for a book, because I feel like there's a lot of information here that I'm going to have to go through really quickly, a lot more quickly than I usually do. For those of you who have been my students, and I know there's several of you on here, you know that sometimes I don't even get through 2 slides in any given talk, including the title slide. So I'm going to try to do better than that today. But today we're really talking about the relationship and kind of the history of urban development patterns and how that is related to resilience. So over the past several years, I've been developing kind of this outline for how to think about social vulnerability and how it impacts recovery and ultimately resilience in communities. And one of the things that I like to say, and because it's easy to remember and it kind of captures the different dynamics that are going on in a lot of communities, is that low-income households live in low-quality homes in low-lying areas. And that is a way to think about how we have distributed our population across the landscape in ways that affects individual households, both access to opportunity, but also their exposure to natural disasters. And many of you are familiar with the definition of social vulnerability, which is that people and households vary in their capacity to anticipate, cope with, respond to, and recover from disasters. We know, especially those of us who are planners, know that people and households are not randomly distributed, but they're concentrated in predictable spatial patterns, most notably based on race, ethnicity, and income. And I'm going to show you, if you don't believe me, I'm going to show you some examples as we go through. We also see that those patterns go hand in hand with the inequitable provision of affordable housing as well as critical infrastructure. And that over time, those patterns will increase exposure to flooding and other hazards that have long and short-term consequences for these populations. So you can see there's a bracket around 3 of these. What I really want to talk about today is, how did these spatial patterns come to be? I talk a lot about segregation and concentrated poverty, but I don't usually talk about how that came to be. So I'm going to do that today. And then I also want to think with you about how those historical spatial patterns have perpetuated inequalities in the built environment that cause differences in how households and neighborhoods are able to respond to disasters. Early on in our NIST project, which we're in, I think, year 7 now, one of the engineers, who will remain unnamed and is no longer on the project, asked me why it matters what the race of the household is in terms of how the structure will respond to a natural disaster, both in terms of damage as well as in terms of recovery and ultimately resilience. And that told me that, while some of this knowledge may be very common to planners, it's not necessarily common to the population as a whole. And I think it really has a strong influence on how we model disaster impacts and the influence of those of damage on recovery, and whether a community is able to become more resilient or less resilient over time. So most of you are familiar with the history of slavery in this country. You know that the Civil War supposedly addressed that issue, but through the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, there was a lot of effort, to put it simply, to maintain the separation of the races. You guys have probably all heard of Jim Crow laws. And so that's what we're talking about here. This idea that legally it was okay to separate the races in terms of how they were provided public facilities. And I highlight the term public facilities here because I think most of us recognize some of these pictures that, yes, there were white and colored water fountains. There were white and colored waiting rooms. There may be restaurants or different places that served whites only or blacks only. But recognize that these are public facilities. They're provided by the government. They are attached to infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, stormwater management infrastructure, water infrastructure, green infrastructure. And so they really, you can imagine even now in terms of how we use our own neighborhoods, entire neighborhoods became separated because it was okay, it was legal under Plessy v. Ferguson to separate those public facilities, even things like swimming pools. This was a really interesting history for me to learn that up until the 1950s, a lot of swimming pools were public, municipal swimming pools, that they were available for whites or blacks. And it wasn't until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that separate but equal was taken apart, was dismantled. And at that time, pools in large part became parts of clubs, became parts of private neighborhoods, which I had never noticed that as a young person, but it makes sense. And now we see a much lower level of ability to swim among the African-American population. And part of that is because of the lack of availability, that we didn't provide pools or make it possible for African-American children to learn to swim. Even some stories from recently talk about the history of parks that were put aside for African-American families in certain parts of the city that didn't have the same level of amenities, that didn't have the same level of maintenance paid to them, and how that might influence children's exposure to recreational uses, to sports, to the safety of parks or the lack of safety of parks. So a lot of this stuff has perpetuated into the future and has continued to affect us. Many of you probably don't recognize that zoning, one of the most commonly associated with planning tools that's out there. When you think of planners, you think of zoning, or you think of transportation and congestion. That's the other one I get a lot. But zoning has a bad or a good reputation depending on who you talk to, but it continues to be a critical tool for land use regulation and planning. It regulates the height and area, location, and the use of buildings. But it came to be in the early 1900s, early 1920s and 1930s, when a lot of laws were passed that permitted zoning. And some of the first zoning was explicitly racial. The first zoning was racial against Chinese laundromats, interestingly enough. Laundromats had been allowed to be in neighborhoods, but the residents didn't like the fumes that were associated with them. And so they wanted to exclude that land use, which had a disproportionate impact on the Chinese owners of those laundries. Later, we see explicitly racial zoning in cities. What you see here is a Cook and Fowler city plan from the city of Austin that talks about the evolution of the Negro districts in Austin and shows them. I wish I could show you, but this is actually one of those little slider tools that shows you how these zones have changed over time. But you can compare where African Americans were allowed to live in the 1930s to where they currently live relative to the city of Austin, and you will see a definite overlap, a definite relationship. You're just going to have to trust me on this one, but I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. You'll also see explicitly racial deed restrictions. So some of these still exist. They were made illegal in 1954 with the civil rights legislation, but there are many properties out there now that might not have changed hands very often since 1954 that may still have racial designations within them. So you can, if you can't read it, I'll read it to you. The part that's in a box says, It is further mutually covenanted that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. So we're not just discriminating against African Americans, we're discriminating against all kinds of different people, people with different skin tones that come from different parts of the world that may or may not speak English, whatever. They weren't white, so they weren't welcome. And these would convey with the property. So you couldn't sell to these sorts of people that are named here. And you can see the kinds of advertisements that were freely in our newspapers at that time. I know it may be surprising to some of you, especially if you're not familiar with American history or the history of racial segregation in this country, racial relationships. Also, another book that blew my mind when I read it is called Sundown Towns by James Lowen, who actually, I think, died within the past 6 months. He wrote this book about cities that basically prohibit African Americans from being in the city after dark. So they certainly couldn't own land or live there, but even for passers through, you better get out before dark or you basically were at risk of lynching, is what these signs are indicating. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of sundown towns. There's a website where you can look them up. I'll let you do that on your own. There are many in Texas, many across the South, but they're not limited to the South. They're all over the Midwest and pretty much every part of the country. And some of these towns continue to have a reputation for being a sundown town, whether they actually operate that way or not. They have that reputation. And so African Americans generally know that they're not welcome there and that they certainly shouldn't attempt to integrate that community or expect to be able to exist as a resident or neighbor. There are lots of other examples of racial violence that happened to African Americans during this time. I actually took out slides in my efforts to be able to get through this about the Tulsa Massacre, which was a case that actually we recognized the 100th anniversary of that event this year, that involved the burning of explicitly African American parts of Tulsa, where they had set up their own system of banking, of grocery stores, of services where they could serve each other. And it was burned by a group of Klansmen. They say up to 300 people may have been killed in that, but the records don't really exist to show that or not. So what I want you to take away from this is that despite having been freed, the Blacks were not given equal rights and were actively prohibited from participating as full citizens in important ways for our purposes, including voting rights, land ownership, home ownership, and access to public facilities. And when they tried to live in white towns and integrate, or if they even tried to build their own neighborhoods, they were met with racial violence. And just out of interest, I wanted to show you, this is actually a graphic that one of our students posted yesterday from laws that were passed by the Texas legislature this week, gerrymandering our US congressional maps. And it's actually a very effective graphic. It shows the proportion of different races and ethnicities in the state of Texas, and then the proportion of districts that are controlled by that race ethnicity. So that you can see that gerrymandering is alive and well, at least in the state of Texas, but many other states too, and that it is done in an effort to minimize the influence of racial or ethnic minorities, which are actually a majority in the state of Texas. No one of them is bigger than whites, but altogether they are. So that this type of prohibition or efforts to block Blacks from being able to participate as full citizens is still ongoing today. Around the same time, we see this interaction or confluence of these types of policies with housing policy. And this is another one of these eye-opening events that I learned about as a graduate student in terms of how housing policy took on this effort and systematized it throughout our development efforts in cities that were growing very rapidly at this time. So as World War II veterans were coming back from the war, there was a housing shortage. And so the federal government took many efforts to increase homeownership. They really wanted to increase homeownership. This is the time when the 30-year fixed rate mortgage that most of us have if we're homeowners was created, which has been a very durable instrument over time. Also the time when the federal government began insuring mortgages so that people could actually borrow the amount of money that was needed to own a home. But one of the important steps that was necessary was the systemization of real estate appraisal methods so that lenders could assess their risk as they were making loans to households. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was formed at this time, and they developed a booklet, basically a guide on real estate appraisals that were widely adopted by private appraisal companies and agents. And they specified, when the bank is assessing its risk, it's looking both at the ability of the occupant to repay the loan, but also importantly, they're looking at whether the value of the house will be maintained over time, because the home, of course, is collateral for the loan. And if the homeowner can't pay the loan, then the bank repossesses the house and can sell it to get its money back. So it was important to the bank that homes maintain their value. And so they developed this grading of neighborhoods from green to red. You can see how those were described. I would love to read them out to you, but I won't take the time. But the main takeaway here is that green is good, and that they're looking at the composition of the population, that they're looking like the ones that are graded yellow and red is the infiltration of lower grade population, the undesirable population or an infiltration of it. And in those areas, lenders were supposed to make fewer loans, if at all, and more expensive loans. So home buyers were awarded the best loans for locating in neighborhoods that were white, that had a separation of uses, that were further from the city's center. And people who wanted to purchase homes in other areas were less likely to get loans to live in neighborhoods that had diverse ethnic composition, mixed uses, or urban locations. So on the left-hand side of this screen, you're looking at two HOLC maps. The one on the top is Houston, and the one on the bottom is Richmond, Virginia. And I chose Houston, of course, because Houston is always my topic of study. Richmond I have here for a couple of reasons. One is that my parents grew up in Richmond during the 50s. In fact, my parents graduated from high school in Richmond in 1959. So they went to segregated schools, both of them. And so Richmond is kind of a second hometown for me. I also happen to have given part of this talk at the University of Virginia, and that's another reason that I chose Richmond, but Richmond really works well for my example. So, a lot of people say, well, does segregation still exist? Why do people live separately, or do people really live separately? And one of the things I like to do with my students is show them these dot density maps. So what you're looking at is a dot density map of Richmond, where one dot represents one person. And the colors, you can see the legend on the side. So you're looking at blue and green here in Richmond, white and black. You can see a little bit of red, tiny bit of yellow, which is Hispanic. But what this very clearly shows is that people in households are not randomly distributed across space, but they are concentrated in patterns that turn out to be quite predictable. I also like to see, you can look at the different densities in terms of how colorful the little neighborhoods are. So you can see a lot of very dense Black neighborhoods and some more dense white neighborhoods, and just a little bit of Hispanic and Asian going on. So how did this pattern come to be? How does this relate to appraisal practices or anything like that? So here is that HOLC map that I just showed you. That it's done in a much nicer way. And you can find a map like this for almost every major city in the United States. And they're fascinating to look at. Most of you have heard the term redlining. This is where the term redlining comes from. These red blocks, where there's a literal line drawn around the neighborhood, are the red lines. And so redlining refers to those neighborhoods in which lenders should not lend. So now I want to show you what they look like overlaid on each other. And these are my little hand drawings. So I put the HOLC map over the dot density map and traced to the lines. And what I want you to observe, because it really shows up very well in Richmond, it doesn't show up as well in Houston. I have those, but I probably won't show them to you unless we have time. But you can see with very little doubt that there is a relationship between neighborhoods that in the 1930s and 40s were designated as hazardous or declining, and where African-American population lives today. So the dots that you see are from the 2010 census, and the lines that you see are from around 1940. So we're talking about 70 years of time that has passed between the designation of these neighborhoods and where people live today. If that doesn't convince you that the lending industry had something to do with how people have settled and that settlement is enduring over time, then I'm really not sure what will. And of course, it's different in different cities. Houston shows up not as clearly as it does in Richmond, but I think that a lot of that is because Houston was a very small city in 1940. Most of Houston's growth has happened since 1970, dramatically so, but it does hold up pretty well. And what others have seen, so this is data from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, is that 74% of the neighborhoods that were graded as hazardous in the 1930s and 40s are low to moderate income today. And that 64% of the neighborhoods that were redlined are now minority neighborhoods. And by comparison, 91% of those that are colored green remain middle to upper income today, and 85% are predominantly white. These are national numbers. This is Philadelphia that you're seeing, and an analysis that was done around 2006, looking at where places that were in troubled home ownership, distressed areas, and you see, of course, that they match up very well with the HOLC maps. So the Fair Housing Act comes along in 1968 and kind of coupled with the civil rights legislation, which supposedly puts an end to discrimination in the housing market. It makes it illegal to use race or ethnicity as a basis for refusing to sell or rent or deny a loan or any of those other things. But research over time, and most of this I pulled over the summer, so these are current numbers, shows that discrimination in lending continues and that it has had a severe impact on Black wealth building, because of course homeownership is a primary way that Blacks build wealth, and why everybody builds wealth that way. For most middle income families, like myself, your house is your biggest asset. It is the thing that you count on to generate wealth for you. Very wealthy people have a lot of diversified investments, but most of us have a lot of our wealth in our homes. And what we've seen is that Black and other minority borrowers are more likely to be denied loans. They're more often charged higher interest rates. They have much lower home ownership rates. They're likely to experience lower house price appreciation and to be over-assessed, which are kind of in conflict with one another, but even more disturbing to see, because it really suggests that discrimination is responsible for it. And as a result, they have lower personal wealth and fewer resources. So how does that, well, I'm not even ready to get to how does that matter to resilience, but I wanted to point this out because this is a really understudied area. And I wanted to bring it up because it's related to infrastructure, which is relevant to our NIST project and the development of NCORE. we see that this kind of discrimination has not only an impact on homes, home buying and building and value and all of that, but that it also carries through to municipal investment and infrastructure. Municipal underbounding is the act of refusing or failing to annex areas that are directly adjacent to a city for the purpose of denying them infrastructure. So I have a friend in North Carolina, Ann Moss Joyner. She and her husband, Alan Parnell, and Ben Marsh, who's a geographer at UNC, have done a lot of work over the years and also a lot of testimony in lawsuits show against cities that show how the cities have done this. And they do pretty simple GIS work, but they show, here's an example from Modesto, where you see the purple line around the city, and then the excluded neighborhoods that have no infrastructure and are heavily Latino. And the blue lines represent the service and trunk lines, and they don't go through the Latino neighborhoods. This is, on the other side, is an example from North Carolina, just outside the Raleigh-Durham area in Pinehurst, where all the golf courses are. And the city of Pinehurst has done the same thing, has systematically excluded small African-American settlements and refused to extend sewer and stormwater management and even water lines to them. There are places in these red areas that you see where families are still literally dragging water in buckets to serve their needs. The same kind of thing happens in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas and really all along the Texas or the US-Mexico border, where Hispanic settlements are excluded from municipal boundaries in a way that prohibits infrastructure from being placed there and places them at much greater risk from flooding, among other things. So to kind of summarize, these are things that are happening both on the private sector and the public sector side. The private sector is guilty of discrimination in the lending and real estate industries, not the least of which are NIMBY behaviors that we see now when we do try to develop affordable housing. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard for you non-planners. And it is when residents fight the development of affordable housing because they don't want poor people living next to them, very bluntly. But the public sector is by no means immune from this. They're the ones that developed appraisal practices, racial zoning. They engage in municipal underbounding. They also engage in the diversion of capital investment away from poor neighborhoods. It's fairly easy to see when you look for it. I have a number of doctoral students, including Marcus Hendricks, who's now at the University of Maryland, who has been able to show that Black neighborhoods are associated with a much higher proportion of open ditches within Harris County and the city of Houston than our white neighborhoods. And I have another student now, Jessica Lee, who has gotten some more detailed data on infrastructure, and she's looking at some of those same kinds of issues with a different data set. So the consequences of this, there's a lot of them, but the ones that I want to point out that are relevant to our work are the disparities in the structural quality of homes. African-American homeowners because they have fewer resources, are more likely to live in older homes and homes that are not properly maintained. Also disparities in the quality of neighborhood infrastructure. And it keeps people from access to good things, but also exposes them to more negative things. Certainly crime is one of the things I was looking at early in my career, but now focus more on things related to hazards and disasters, including pollution in both air and water, which is a huge problem in Houston. A lot of the work that Phil Burke, who's on today, has done with CUU, who's also on the call today, and Matt on the call today, working in the Houston area with neighborhoods that have extensive pollution in the soil and water because of the petroleum industry that is so prevalent in Houston. We are also, just because it's relevant to today, look at the spread of disease. When I first made this slide, I was talking about mosquito-borne diseases, but it's relevant for COVID as well, in terms of access to green space, access to open air, and how that helps or hinders the spread of disease. So these patterns result in increased physical vulnerability for socially vulnerable populations. So that's one of the key things I want you to take away from this, is that yes, we have socially vulnerable people and households, but where they can live exposes them to greater physical vulnerability as well. These are a couple of different maps of Harris County, Houston. One shows the geography of vulnerability, where the darker colors show higher levels of a social vulnerability index that Walt and I developed about a decade ago. And then you kind of see on the other side what we might call the geography of opportunity. And this is really showing roughly the distribution of wealth across Houston. And you can see, just visually, you can see that there's a relationship between wealth and vulnerability. When we're looking at vulnerability, we're looking at things like single female-headed households, race, ethnicity, and income, but also education, civic capacity, gender, disability, a lot of different vulnerabilities. And there's, to me at least, very clearly a relationship. To take that into how that affects damage. So here we're looking at damage from Hurricane Harvey. And on the left-hand side, you're looking at income. So the greener it is, the wealthier it is. The lighter color is lower levels of income. And then on the right, race, ethnicity, where the reddish color is white. The blue is Hispanic, and like the teal color, which that was not a good choice, but I didn't make these maps, is African American. And anybody might look at this map and say, well, there was a lot of damage in white areas too. And you can see that in this, what we often refer to as kind of the arrow of Houston, this is Houston's west side, the Galleria and the Westheimer corridor that tends to be very wealthy. But there's also wealthy areas down here that are, this is along Gray's Bayou. For those of you who know Houston, I actually lived there for a year, and it's a fairly wealthy, although older neighborhood that has gotten worse and worse in terms of flooding over the years. But I think if you look broadly, especially at the income map, you can see that the majority of the damage is in poorer areas that are heavily minority, Hispanic and Black. And remember that Houston is a very diverse city. It's about a third white, a third Black, and a third Hispanic, although it also has a fairly sizable Asian and Asian American community as well. So do these patterns matter? And the research that I've done with Walt and others shows that yeah, it does. We'll get to the next slide, but this shows kind of our approach to looking at social vulnerability. We can layer the 100-year floodplain over it. We can layer the different surge categories over it, seeing how that interacts with the level of vulnerability. It's not a perfect system, but it gives us a good sense of where those vulnerable areas might be. We have found through the work that we've done in Galveston that the patterns do matter. And that in Hurricane Ike, we did see a strong correlation between social vulnerability and evacuation rates, damage rates, whether a household applied for aid. And I think that's an important one to remember, as well as damage to minority neighborhoods, even when accounting for the things that really should make a difference, like how close they are to the water and whether or not they're behind the seawall. The map that you see on the inset shows the different development patterns across Galveston. Galveston has an urban core, which is this heavily populated area. This is where most of their service labor lives. So the people that work in the restaurants and the people that work at the port and different places like that. There is a major hospital in this area that has some of the more middle and upper income employees, but this is where the people who live on Galveston Island permanently live. And then there's this whole line of vacation homes down what we call the west end of Galveston, this is a little community called Jamaica Beach, which is an entirely vacation home type of place. And so we will see in a minute that those make a difference, that what you see in the urban core are homes like the one in the lower corner, which was on pier and beam and basically just slid off its piers during Hurricane Ike. But then we see homes along the west end, the vacation homes, some of which are raised 12 to 14 feet off the ground and have piers that go 8 to 10 feet into the ground, and they receive very little damage from Hurricane Ike. So when we think about what that means for recovery and ultimately for resilience, this is a figure that we developed several years ago, and I'm just going to kind of click through so you can see everything. That we have these pre-existing inequities, which hopefully you're relatively convinced of at this point. And then you experience an impact, and you see that those with the lower levels of advantage experience greater impact. So I highlighted the angles here. You would imagine that this is a steeper angle than this one. And so it doesn't go down as far, and that it's a shallower angle coming through recovery. And so what we see is that those with the most disadvantage have shallower recovery trajectories and may never reach restoration. So these dotted lines represent restoration for these different inequalities, which could be anything, could be income, could be education levels, or any kind of thing. But that the higher levels of income or advantage do restore over time and may even get better. And so I conceptualize this difference between restoration and an improvement as increased resilience, and maybe dramatically increased resilience. But for our lower income or lower advantaged group, they may never recover, and in doing so, they actually become less resilient. So keep this image in mind, because now I'm going to show you some empirical data that looks remarkably similar. So Walt and I, along with some of our colleagues, were able to do comparisons of housing recovery from Miami, 1992's Hurricane Andrew, which Walt experienced personally, and then 2008's Hurricane Ike that struck Galveston. And I really love these graphs, because one of the things that they show really clearly is that the lower value homes received more damage to begin with. So what I want you to notice here is that these are the beginning values of the home. And yes, they are remarkably low. Remember, this was 1992. Even in 2008, very low values. We're in Texas. Remember, it's cheap here. We don't regulate anything. But notice that those homes that received the most extensive damage in both cases were already lower value to begin with. And so those inequalities that we started with, right? Lower value homes translate into greater damage and slower recovery. And you do see in both Miami-Dade and Galveston that even within 4 years, those with the most extensive damage, which were also the lowest value homes, had not regained their original value within 4 years. But those that received very little damage almost had no dip at all, and actually just continued increasing in value over time. So that's maybe an indicator of increased resilience, but definitely an indicator of less of a disruption in their daily lives and their source of wealth, their home value. We also saw that owner-occupied homes suffered less damage and recovered more quickly over time. So this is actually looking at housing tenure, which is another a really big interest of mine. And showing that these more vulnerable residents, because renters are more vulnerable, are more likely to be displaced after a disaster, and they have almost no control over whether their housing is rebuilt. Multifamily housing is more volatile than single family housing, both in Miami-Dade and Galveston. The multifamily homes, which are typically occupied by lower income folks, recovered more slowly. They took 4 or more years to recover. So I want, just for this last few minutes, and I'm already over more time than I wanted to be, but I want us to think about these intersections between physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, and hazard exposure. And I'm going to take us back to that first statement that I said. low income households live in low quality homes in low lying areas. So this is where that intersection of risk exposure, living in low lying areas, coupled with lower quality homes, older homes, homes that aren't properly maintained, and low income households or African American households or Hispanic households, they are the ones living in those areas. And so these represent hotspots for, as a planner, for areas where we can try to make a difference. And I think about it in a few ways, a couple of ways of how we can do that. One of them is through land use planning, where we're actually pulling those circles apart so that there are no overlaps. And what that would mean is that we're actually separating the structure from the hazardous area, which is not possible for all hazards, but for flooding, it is. So many people in Texas tell me, well, we don't build in the floodplain. It's not legal to build in the floodplain. Well, take a look at Houston. And there is a significant part of the population that is located in the floodplain, both the 100-year and 500-year floodplain, significant. And it's in every city, every city. Another way we can do it is to actually shrink those circles so that they don't overlap anymore. And I think about that in a couple of ways. When you're shrinking your physical vulnerability, that may be through the structural mitigation approaches that are, more popular with engineers sometimes, where we're reducing the physical vulnerability by elevating the home, by putting up dams or levees to prevent them from flooding, or from increasing building codes to make them more resilient in that way. So that would be one way of reducing physical vulnerability, or a few ways of reducing it, actually. And then we also can think about reducing social vulnerability. And these are not commonly thought of as tools for hazard planners, but for planners, these are things that are in our wheelhouse: anti-poverty programs, capacity building, educational programs, other social services that actually reduce social vulnerability. And we can also see improvements in policies and practices that actually penalize the poor, minorities, women, elderly, children, and renters, of which there are many. Just one example, renters in Texas, there's no disclosure about whether they're in a floodplain or not when they move into a unit. They have no idea what their risk is. I think that's changing, but it's taken a long time to get there. So as a kind of to conclude, this is another graphic that shows kind of how to think about this. And remember, going back to all of the historical practices that created social vulnerability in terms of the distribution of people across space. The social vulnerabilities lead to disparities in exposure, insurance, financial resources that results in more damage, longer recovery, more need for recovery, and ultimately may cause permanent displacement or exacerbation of inequities. I did take a moment, because I know John would want me to think about what this means for NCORE. And so what I want, and I think I've made this point to the engineers in our NCORE group, is that these processes that we're looking at in terms of what causes damage and how restoration and recovery can be accomplished, it's more than just a function of physical characteristics. And I know the social scientists, we really press on this, but we need to look at the fine-grained geographies. We need to look past the population means, because the means for each race ethnicity group are going to be quite different. And just pursuing the mean of the entire population will mean that those that are on, are in a different part of the distribution are going to be treated differently. And it's not going to be random. It's going to be very specific and biased. We need to disaggregate populations so that we can see what's happening to each one of them. And we need to examine our assumptions in terms of the distribution of housing quality, the availability of resources, whether it's insurance or even getting aid from FEMA or just any place, SBA loans. We see that those are going to be different for different races and ethnicities. But I also want you to keep in mind that the recovery process almost always leads to an overall loss of affordable housing. It's almost unavoidable. But I want people to be aware of that, because as we're trying to become more resilient, one way of becoming more resilient is to displace your poor people. That is not the type of resilience that I want us to be building. You know, we can make it impossible for people to live in our communities and increase our community resilience that way. But we're pushing that need off onto another community, and we're not making those people more resilient overall. And the other one that's a difficult one for us sometimes is that there's a strong desire to increase building standards. And I definitely understand that and agree with it to a certain extent, but it does make housing less affordable for low income households. And so we want to balance the needs of trying to preserve as much affordable housing as we can, and also making it safer for the people that live there. So that I'm done, and I did it within the hour.